Is there a difference in women's suffrage between advocacy of white women and African American women? Yeah, there absolutely was. I mean, you have to remember there is a difference in man. So allow me to preface this with saying everything I'm saying now could possibly be incorrect. I think it's right, and what I've learned during the time of working with Dr. Reed is what I'm going to say now. Dr. Reed and I work in this area, but I'm not going to gloss over anything. Dr. Reed is the reason why I know anything about this stuff. She is an excellent teacher, and I say that as someone who has learned more from her than anyone I've learned from since grad school. If you have the opportunity to take a class from Dr. Reed, take a class from Dr. Reed. But the initial women's suffrage movement was a white movement, if not explicitly, implicitly. And much of the women's rights movement was a white movement. They were trying to get the right to vote for themselves. There are differences in what these movements look like. In fact, during the 1960s, when the civil rights movement itself was taking place, there was a co-equal movement within the civil rights movement that pushed for increased rights for African American women. The problem of that was it was not accepted in large part by white women who were pushing for equal rights for themselves, and also within the general civil rights movement itself amongst African Americans, that movement of African American women was also sidelined. So they weren't even accepted by the movement of which basically they felt a part of. So yes, there's absolutely differences. We like to talk about this thing called intersectionality. And first time I've used that word in this class. But when we think about how laws affect and discriminate against individuals, it's very easy to identify that law X treats men differently from women. We're going to cover, I'll give you an example just to make it really clear. But we're going to deal with a case probably on Tuesday that says that that the law says that women cannot tend bar, so can't be a bartender, unless their husband or father owns the bar. That's a law from Michigan. That's a very Michigan law. But it's very easy to look at that law and go, holy shit, men are treated different from women. And institutionally, that's how it is. But when you take the next step and go, okay, there are other dimensions that would affect this as well. And the answer is absolutely. When you fold the racial dimension on top of this, is there a reason to assume that that law would be differently applied to African Americans? Yeah, of course there would be. And African American women, when this is considered, when intersectionality is taken into account, and this applies to many women of color, same with indigenous peoples, same, especially growing up, seeing life here in El Paso, especially of women of color in El Paso, the effects are different. And legally, we don't take that into account. We're very bad at it. And so the intersectional effects of institutions that are built to discriminate, A, based in a history of white supremacy, and B, based in a history of gender discrimination, which are very evident and clear in the United States, means that women of color sort of get a legal double whammy. And so the movements of women of color in the United States, almost always, in terms of suffrage, in terms of equal rights, the movements of women of color are almost always distinct from white women, and they're almost always less effective. Not because of effort, not because of energy, but because in many cases, women of color are fighting against not just the more broader-based, gender-based discrimination, but they're also fighting against discrimination within their own race as well. The stereotypes are confounded twice for them, and so it's more difficult. And I realize that there's a lot of irony that all of this is being said by a big fat white dude who has a PhD and is wealthy. I recognize that. So the messenger should not be taken away